What is a society without history? Bricks, dirt, ashes. Without the stories, the memories of the ones who built it, there's nothing. Without people, there's no life, no heart. And history, it's more than just facts left in newspapers, books, and archives for someone to reference. Real history is the look and feel of the people, the quirkiness and spunk that every soul added to the group. No two cities are the same, from Metamora to Spiceland, from Cairo to Timbuktu. Every place on this planet has its own story, one that deserves to be preserved. For the sake of its legacy, for the sake of its memory, for the sake of each individual person who brought it into existence. This is Muncie, Indiana.
I really became interested in historic preservation after I started in architecture, and I was going to Ball State and wanted to move out of married student housing and just sort of blundered into an apartment in a Victorian house in the Emily Kimbrough district. Well, I think my first brush with it was when I was 4 years old, and there was a big Victorian house across the street from where we lived, which of course all of us 4-year-olds considered to be the haunted house, and it had the quintessential grumpy old lady living in it.
Well, why don't we start where I was standing on the corner watching them go at the courthouse, which was the 3rd Delaware County Courthouse. It was Tolan designed. He was a Fort Wayne architect. It was right at the beginning of the gas boom. It started in 1886. It was kind of the model for this area, which I didn't know at the time because I was only 7. I couldn't imagine why they were tearing this building down, because it was one of the better courthouses in the state of Indiana, which at last count, I think, of the 92, only 6 have been torn down, and they're all right here in the surrounding counties. That kind of sparked my interest in preservation. And at the same time, nationwide, it sparked everybody's because of the wholesale slaughter of historic districts, or what would be historic districts, by normally government entities. They would go in and knock down, in major cities, block on block of buildings.
Historic preservationists come out of a lot of different worlds, some out of the realm of history, and they're just interested in the history, and old buildings are sort of the physical manifestation of things that have gone on and so forth, so they come out of that interest. Others come out of the architectural background and are fascinated with the old buildings because of the architecture and the styles that have evolved.
You've got 2 types of preservationists. You've got the one type who loves the houses and just wants to live in the houses. Then you've got the other one who enjoys the history, and I think that's where I fall. I think every house has the story. You don't think about it, I don't think so much, unless it was a family home of your own. But those people, especially in the Kimbrough Historic District, were the people that built Muncie.
Muncie was a boom town. It was a thriving city that was growing incredibly quickly, particularly in the period from about 1886 to 1895. The city seemed to be doubling in size every 3 or 4 years. Buildings were going up very rapidly. People were coming and starting new businesses, new factories particularly. And a certain set of those people made a great deal of money at this time. And so they were able to build large, impressive houses, very ornate Victorian-style houses. If you go back and look at the brochures advertising the city in the late 19th century, you see a lot of these houses appearing in images and sketches. And so these opulent homes were sort of a symbol of the prosperity of the city.
Muncie's suffering with some really big changes. Over the last couple of decades, most of its traditional economic base, which is manufacturing, has gone away.
As the university grew and thrived, and as Muncie's downtown declined, which was in some ways connected with the decline of industry in the town, the neighborhoods right around the downtown area, meaning the Old West End, the Kimbrough District, lost even more of their appeal.
We have 4,600 vacant homes citywide, and that's in a city of about 65,000. And inevitably, some of those are not only vacant, but abandoned and deteriorating. And not at all surprisingly, a lot of the deteriorated ones are in the oldest neighborhoods, and those are the historic ones as well. You've got to temper preservation with a dose of reality and preserve the very best of what we have every time we get a chance. There's a house at 515 South Council Street, kind of in the old West End Historic District.
The Whitney Hospital is important because it was basically Muncie's first hospital. Technically, it wasn't a city hospital. It was a privately owned hospital.
He contracted with the city, and through that contract, they provided medical services to folks who might not have otherwise been able to afford them. Before that time, if you were in Muncie and you needed surgery, you had to go to another community somewhere. Of course, travel was difficult in those days, so you might or might not have made it to Indianapolis if you were really sick. The hospital continued operating until the 1920s when Dr. Whitney died. And at that point, it was converted into apartments. There's a persistent rumor that the bank robber John Dillinger and his gang stayed in one of those apartments for a while and were nearly caught there. I've done a fair amount of research on Dillinger and have yet to come up with any corroboration to that story, so it may just be a myth. But it's kind of interesting. There's an alley that runs up behind the house, but it bumps into a large piece of property, so it doesn't flow through to the next street. It jogs, and supposedly Dillinger and his crew had their cars back in that alley, and as the police stormed the front of the building, they were able to sneak away. Dillinger never robbed a bank in Muncie because he was always afraid that his getaway might be blocked by a train. He did rob a bank in Daleville, Indiana, just a few miles from here, but never hit one in Muncie.
It was built in 1891, survived till about 1910.
It is in terrible shape, has been vacant for a very long time. We're trying to keep it boarded up.
The buildings on both sides of it are going to be torn down, and I think it'll give a little more oomph to the hospital being restored.
It's kind of crammed in there with buildings very close on either side. So if we're able to get rid of the bad ones on either side of it, we may have a better chance of attracting someone to redevelop that house. There's various reasons why we like to preserve old buildings. You know, maybe it's the architecture or just that they're beautiful, but sometimes the building tells a story about where we've been. To look at this building and imagine it as Muncie's first hospital, it's a pretty tiny building, especially when you compare it to Ball Memorial Hospital now. You know, you look at a building that's the size of an 8-unit apartment building, and it's hard to imagine a time when that was adequate to serve the city's hospital needs. It reminds us how different things were not that very long ago. And secondly, preserving any building and putting it into productive use again is a good thing for the city. It puts it back on the tax rolls. We're fulfilling some kind of need that the community has, so always better when we can find a new use, bring them back to life, and put them back to work. There's another house in the Emily Kimbrough district on East Washington Street that we like telling stories about. We call it the Over Vate house. We think it was built about 1902. It was built by the Over family, and it's sort of a Dutch colonial neoclassical house with a really grand two-story front porch and gambrel roof, and just a really neat piece of architecture, but also with some fun stories behind it.
Its history is rich in who were involved, who lived there. To start with, it was Charles and Matilda Over. They owned the Over Glass Company, which came here, a product of the gas boom.
We frequently refer to it as the Over Vate house because very shortly after the building was built, the Overs and the Vates basically swapped houses on Washington Street.
They owned the Fair store here in Muncie, which was a major department store.
We used to tell the story for a long time in the neighborhood that one of the Overs' daughters committed suicide in the house, and that Mrs. Over, she just couldn't stand living in the house after that happened, and that was why the Overs and the Vates swapped houses.
They did move out of the house. It was then owned by the Harry Kitzelman family. The Kitzelmans owned Indiana Steel and Wire. Harry was kind of the renegade of the family, if you will. He ran for political offices through the Progressive Party, which, if I'm not mistaken, was kind of backed by the KKK. At this time, it was also regional headquarters for the Ku Klux Klan. Children who grew up in the neighborhood playing on the third floor. By that time, it had been made into a ballroom. It originally was a gymnasium and servants' rooms, but the white robes were all hung in closets around the ballroom. The thing about the KKK in Muncie, we knew they were active. Lots of people in Muncie were members, very prominent people, but there never seemed to be any problems in Muncie. When you think about it, the lynchings at Marion and problems in Indianapolis, I have yet to find any reference in the newspapers to any problems. The house after that went to the Phi Del, which is a social fraternity. They owned it until 1976, and by that point, the house was on the verge of being demolished, if you will, by all practical purposes.
As the neighborhood declined, that house had a hard life and was basically rescued in the 1980s by Cliff Johnson and his wife Betty. One of the terrible things that happened is between having their offer on the house accepted and closing, someone stole the two gorgeous stained glass windows from that appear at the stair landing out of the house. So ultimately they had to have those reproduced.
Since then, it has gone through 3 other families who have all continued to restore it. It's basically restored now to what it was when it was built, but it's taken 3 families to get there.
Anybody who's been in Muncie for about 15 minutes knows we have a lot of railroad traffic through town. There are 80 trains a day, generally with 3 locomotives and about 80 cars.
Rail stations are definitely a very good indication of Indiana as a crossroads of America, and they're everywhere. The rail lines had exploded during the gas boom. The CR&M, or the Cincinnati, Richmond, and Muncie rail line, was a passenger and freight rail line, so not only did it bring a lot of people to Muncie, but it also brought a lot of products and even opened up Indiana to travel to Chicago.
The other interesting story is the interurban system that crisscrossed Indiana every which way. They were basically like streetcars. Today we'd call it light rail. And the interurban system was fabulous. You could jump on the interurban and get from Muncie to Chicago or to Indianapolis, and it was a really cool system. It's really a shame that we've lost all that right-of-way. But the Great Depression really pretty much killed that system. The ridership went down. Most of the track was laid around the turn of the century, so by the time you got to the late 20s, early 30s, there were some big infrastructure needs. Things were needing to be replaced in a big way. So they were facing both the need to spend a lot of money plus the impact of a bad economy, and it pretty much killed the systems. You know, while we've lost those interurban right-of-ways, some of the normal railroad right-of-ways now are being converted into rails to trails programs.
The current rails to trail system is a very new thing in preservation, where they take abandoned rail lines and they tear out the rail line and make it a really nice nature walk or bike path. And that is what Muncie has done to preserve not only the landscape, but the idea of the railroad itself. Here we are sitting at the Weiser Street Depot, which is a preserved train station in Muncie, and it serves as a reference to Muncie and Indiana being the crossroads of America. There are several train stations in the state of Indiana that have been preserved. I have done a project in Richmond, Indiana, where the twin of this station is located. The little depot is what we called it in Richmond. It is almost exactly the identical twin of this station, only it has not been preserved. There is a lot of peeling paint, and luckily not a lot of vandalism, but it has been threatened with demolition because nobody knows what to do with it.
The old Chesapeake and Ohio passenger depot on Weiser Street was in horrible disrepair and hadn't been used for railroad purposes for a long, long time. And it was one of the last projects I got to do was to design the restoration of that depot, which now serves as Cardinal Greenway's trailhead and a stopping point on the Greenway. So we were able to replace the clay tile roof on the building, rebuild dormers that had disappeared, and really bring it back to original.
Train stations are a type of architecture that is going to be soon forgotten because not a lot of people travel by train anymore. So preserving them is essentially preserving an important part of history, especially in Indiana.
The cemetery was started in 1841. It was combined from two other cemeteries, one which was on East Jackson, one was on Adams Street. Those graves were all moved there, so that was the central cemetery for Muncie. It was actually landscaped by O.W. Krabs, who was a local person interested in landscape design.
The landscape at Beech Grove is actually an example of a Gothic revival landscape. It became a really nice rolling, hilly place for people to stroll and reflect and escape Victorian industrial life in general.
He was superintendent for a number of years. He was the one that got local architect Kuno Kibley to build the big arch, the waiting station, which is now used as the office, and a chapel, which was back in the cemetery.
Beech Grove Cemetery is on the National Register of Historic Places, which is very rare because they usually do not accept cemeteries. But because of the architectural influences in the tombstones and the fact that it is a very good example of a Gothic revival landscape, it was added.
The city never set up a fund when it was started, so now the wall's fallen down. The mausoleums are in halfway decent shape. The gate was basic restoration done on that several years ago. But when stones get turned over or something, it's up to the cemetery basically to use their money to repair them. So the city has to foot the bill for the maintenance. So in that aspect, it's important to preserve it. It should have been set up differently to start with. The Delaware County Historic Society, one of our groups is cemetery preservation. They've talked about doing some stuff in Beech Grove, but it's really beyond their capabilities as far as the amount of work that really should be done. And a lot of it's the physical plant of the cemetery, the walls, the arch, and the buildings.
It is important that Beech Grove Cemetery is preserved because it is a very important landscape historically. There are a lot of historic families that have been buried in Beech Grove, and actually it is running out of room. And many fear that once the final burial is done, it's going to be neglected and it's not going to be maintained and will just be forgotten.
Muncie's history is there, if you will. Everybody that did anything in Muncie, the Balls have their mausoleums. George McCullough owned the Union Traction. James Boyce, who was an early pioneer. Thomas Kirby, who was instrumental in bringing the railroads to Muncie. The Kimbroughs, and all the dentists, the doctors, the photographers, the architects, and it goes on and on. That's a whole nother side of it. Along with their houses, their grave sites survive, which is tying all this together.
You don't have to be an architect or a professional to develop an appreciation for the history behind an old house, or to care about taking care of it and keeping it the way it should be and respecting its original construction and so forth. It's very important to cities to preserve as much of their history as possible. I'm a real realist about preservation. Every old building that we love was put there because somebody needed a place to live, or somebody thought they could make a buck if they built a building somewhere. So we have to find ways to make our old buildings functional and usable in the modern day. We need to be a little flexible sometimes about making some changes that bring them into modern life while respecting their history at the same time.
Muncie's not going to be a factory town in the future. It's going to be more of a college town. It's going to be more of a regional city that provides services to the surrounding area. And to do that successfully and to really redevelop itself successfully, it has to create an identity for itself. And one of the best ways to do that is really to preserve its past. You have these beautiful houses arrayed along attractive streets running off of downtown. You have these very nice residential districts, not only in the downtown area, but over by the university and elsewhere in the city. And so keeping those things, and particularly keeping the older sections alive and in good shape, I think is one of the ways in which you can really make an impression on people about what kind of city this is.
Historic preservation's it's really important. It tells us where we've been, it reminds us of where we've been, and if we don't know that, it's kind of hard to know where we're going.